You know when you get to the end of a book and you could feel something shift and you can't believe you have to leave that world? Back on the winter solstice, I set myself a reading challenge for the year where I came up with a bunch of themes that would sort of explore the Anthropocene and how it is to be a human being living during the climate crisis and the other many connected crises. And I created a list of books that were a mix of non-fiction, fiction and poetry, but I thought it would be nice, now that it is the summer solstice, to review the climate fiction, which is still sort of an emerging genre, both the good and the not so good. But just before we begin, can I just share how beautiful, can I show it? Oh, that's dangerous. I have very beautiful tea. It is red clover, chamomile, yarrow, cinnamon and ginger. But let's get on to the books. The first theme of the year was reimagining work and success. So I looked for books that questioned mainstream ideas of what it means to live and be successful and be happy, and what do we need for those things. And I read a couple of books under this theme, but the one that I would actually classify as climate fiction was The Light Pirate by Lily Brooks-Dalton. I would love to wave the books at you, by the way, but I actually don't have any of them because I borrowed all of them from the library. And this was the first book that I've read that was recommended to me by Storygraph. So Storygraph, it's like Goodreads, but it's not connected to Amazon. And it looks at what you read and it looks at what preferences you have and it can suggest books. And it had been suggesting The Light Pirate to me for a very long time. And I was very dubious because I don't tend to believe in algorithms. And so I really didn't know what to expect, but I loved this book. It follows generations of a family living in Florida in a near undefined future, and it's a Florida that is just being ravaged by climate disaster after climate disaster, mainly hurricanes and floods. And I think one of the big questions in the book that really got me thinking, and I'm still thinking about it to this day, even though I read it back in January, is what world are we trying to prop up? As in, what systems are we trying to keep alive when maybe we really shouldn't be trying to keep them alive, or maybe we really shouldn't be so reliant on them. So one of the main characters is a lineman, which means that he repairs electricity lines. And with all the hurricanes, he's basically constantly going out trying to repair the electricity. So I think this quote kind of perfectly summarizes. He put his trust in electricity, in a kind of civilization that requires politics and oversight and dollars. The house isn't worth anything, and once the power goes and the supermarket folds and the gas stations sell their last gallon, money won't be worth anything either. Not here. The book, even without giving too many spoilers, it also questions and pokes holes in the sort of survivalist attitude as well, as in, people who are trying to prep and get themselves ready for climate change. The world might change so much that won't even be enough, and we'll just have to completely find a new way to live and survive. I really fell in love with it, and by the end it was one of those experiences of like, wow, I can't believe I've lived through this. And when you get to the end of a book and you could feel something shift and you can't believe you have to leave that world, at the same time as it's really sad, like really sad in multiple times, it also felt like a love letter to humanity. To me, at least, I felt like it was a love letter to humanity, both at its best and at its worst. It was a love letter to change, to resilience, to survival, to regeneration. And yeah, I am still thinking about it so much, even all these months on, because it made me really reflect, what am I doing? What am I doing to survive? What world am I trying to build and live in? What systems am I too reliant on still? And what alternatives do I want to see for myself, but also for other people? It sounds like a depressing question, but it's also what this book shows is that it can also be quite hopeful and revelatory to ask yourself, how am I going to survive? How am I going to live when everything collapses? The next theme of the year was trees and radical kinship, and I read two pieces of climate fiction. The first was Löpa by Kerstin Ekman, and unfortunately there isn't any translation. I think it's in Estonian and Finnish and that kind of thing, basically only Nordic and Balkan languages. But yeah, this book was about an older man, a retired man, who has been leading a hunting group for many years. But then one day he encounters a wolf, sort of more like he meets the eyes of the wolf, more sort of visceral, personal encounter for the first time. And it kind of changes everything for him. And he has this like real realization about how he wants to relate to the forest, how he wants to relate to wolves. And he starts thinking about his place and rethinking the ideas of hunting. Thinking about how we have relationships with animals. At least hunting is something that it can actually create a sense of connection to the forest by being out there and having to trace the animals and find their footprints. And he, explains how the hunting for him is really a form of getting to know the animal, because you have to know the animal so well to be able to find the animal. But yeah, because he has this personal encounter, he starts rethinking sort of the morality of it and whether he should be hunting. I will say that I didn't love the book. It's possibly because of the Swedish, actually, because it was written in quite a regional Swedish, and so sometimes I was really struggling to understand. But I also do feel like the book couldn't quite pin down on a genre. Like it tried to be almost a detective novel towards the end. It was skönlitteratur, it was like nature writing. Yeah, it was like it couldn't quite settle. I don't know, there was something that didn't quite hit with this book when I look at it overall, but there were certain passages where it was describing this man's like depth of kinship with the animals around him and with the wolf that he sees that were really beautiful and really powerful in terms of thinking about more than human kinship. The next book I read was Drömmen om ett träd by Maja Lunde, or Dream of a Tree, and this one is available in English. And this is the final book in the Climate Quartet series, and I have now read the entire quartet. I've actually thought about doing a video exploring some of the themes in the full quartet. Let me know if that's something that you'd be interested in seeing. The format of the series is that there's a historical character, a character in the kind of ish present day, and then a character in this dystopian future of climate collapse. And the 3 previous books had that breadth, whereas this final book I was actually purely set in the future. And it's focused on this small community that is living up in Svalbard, one of the few remaining pockets of humanity in a world where bees have died out and there's water shortages everywhere, and there's literally like complete climate collapse. But there's this small pocket of community, and they are protecting the seed bank there, which is actually a real thing. There is a seed bank there. And so this book really felt like, most of all, like a love letter to seeds. Because when you think about seeds, they're so cool. And also the biodiversity that we have on this world, such a variety of different plants. But in that context, this book is exploring, like the entire series explores actually, responsibility. And is it our responsibility as human beings to take care of nature? And if so, how? Like, what does it mean actually to be a good parent? Does it mean trying to control everything that happens to ensure your idea of a best life or best survival? But where do you also need to relinquish that control and let the child have agency, even if that might mean death? And every book in the series has the characters, the main characters, are parents in some way. And so it's a lot about how they're looking after their direct biological child, but then it's set within this wider context of how are they / we as humanity looking after nature as a child, even though nature is very much not a child, and nature very much does not need us. So there's a lot of really interesting themes in this series, and in this book in particular, that don't come to a neat conclusion. I think that's quite nice and quite interesting, that the book doesn't come down on a side of we should be taking responsibility in this way, or it sort of problematizes everything. And they're really beautifully written as well, and such good characterization. Lunde writes these characters that quite often aren't very nice, aren't very empathetic, you don't like them, but because you understand their motivations and you understand why they make certain choices so deeply, you sympathize with them anyway, and you're like, okay, I can understand why you've chosen to do this, even though it's the wrong choice, but I can really understand why you've chosen it. And that's such an interesting place to be reading and be with these characters for such a long time, where you're like, I don't like you, but I understand you. And as for Dream of a Tree, I would say it's my second favourite of the series. My absolute favourite was Blå, and I really enjoyed the fact that it was entirely set in the future. I sometimes found some of the historical figures in the other books a little bit annoying, but I will say, it wasn't the most compelling read. It felt a bit too long. honestly. It felt like it could have been a good 100 pages shorter. It felt like the plot wasn't that captivating. Some things got a little bit repetitive, but I still really recommend it. I really recommend the whole series, actually. I really enjoyed them. The next theme was climate justice, and for this I read The Tiger's Share by Keshava Guha. And one of the reasons I read this book was because it was shortlisted for the Climate Fiction Prize this year in 2026. The novel is about women in Delhi trying to get their family's inheritance, but in the context of a heavily polluted city where the seasons are changing due to climate change, and they're also up against a rising tide of, I'm going to sort of summarise it as patriarchal nationalist politics. So the book explores who gets to inherit what in a polluted climate disaster world, at the same time as exploring intersectionality in terms of the sexism that the women still face in India. But what's interesting is that these are pretty upper class women, like they are the most privileged in the Indian society. So there's a lot of questions being raised about privilege and who gets what and why. And as I think is quite clear from that description, it's such an interesting premise, but I'm not gonna lie, personally, I really didn't like the execution. I think the book is meant to be written with this dry wit, but I personally felt that it was heavy on the dry and low on the wit. Like, it almost had a kind of Victorian feel in the way that every character that was introduced, they were introduced in terms of their family background and their career and education. And obviously that makes so much sense because it's about inheritance, it's about prejudice, it's about who, you know, where do people stand in society. But I just found, like, after a while of every character being introduced in this way, I was just like, I don't care. I'm sorry, I don't. Like, it kept on going into depth about these characters' backgrounds before you've been given a reason to know why you care about this character yet. Those descriptions is where, like, I really think it was meant to be very witty, and I just didn't find it very witty. And something that also really got on my nerves was there was a hell of a lot of fat phobia. Now, if I'm being generous, I could say that the point of the fat phobia was to show how the narrator of the book is very judgmental. I think that probably was why it's there. It doesn't necessarily mean that the author is fat phobic, but I will say that reading about every character being described according to how wide they are and their muscle to fat ratio, after a while I was just like, oh, stop. It could almost be quite triggering the way it talks about bodies. I also felt like the most interesting storyline was the father of the narrator. He basically has this big epiphany about climate change, about injustice, and he decides not to pass on his inheritance to his children. That's kind of the catalyst for the entire book, so that's not a spoiler or anything. And yet it's sort of treated like a side plot. The narrator and her friend are mostly dealing with stuff with their brother, and there's other stuff going on. Yeah, the father idea kind of becomes a side plot, and which makes, again, from like a narrative perspective, I understand why the author's chosen to do that, because the whole point is that they don't understand what's going on in their father's head, and they don't understand why he's decided to make this choice. So you can't have too much insight into it, because the narrator doesn't have insight into it. But as a reader, that just was... like, it was such an interesting concept, and I really wanted to hear more from the father. I think I only gave this book like 2.5, maybe 2 stars. I can see why it got chosen for the shortlist of the Climate Fiction Prize. I can see that it was interesting to like read from a world that I really don't know much about. I just didn't like the execution. Maybe, I think if you like family dramas, if you like books that analyse people, I think you would really like this book. I just don't think it was for me. Also under the theme of climate justice, I'm reading Stöld or Stolen by Ann-Helén Laestadius, which is a book by a Sami author exploring climate change and racism against the Sami community in northern Sweden. I haven't finished reading it yet, so I won't review it, but I will just throw that in as another book that I'm reading under the category of climate justice. The next theme was rebellion, so I decided to read The Testaments by Margaret Atwood, which is the very well-known sequel to her game-changing, hugely famous book, The Handmaid's Tale, and it explores 3 other women's perspectives in and outside of Gilead. Now, I actually would gently categorise this book as climate fiction. It's not super obvious, it's not like super part of the plot, but it is very much hinted at, and Margaret Atwood has talked about the fact the reason Gilead, this authoritarian regime, comes to be is partly because of climate pressures. It's due to pollution that is affecting fertility rates, it's due to failing agricultural yields. The book is focusing on the dystopian outcome of that world, you know, the authoritarian rise to power as a response to these climate pressures, which is literally what is happening right now, by the way. Now, an important thing to note about me reading the Testaments. I wrote my dissertation when I did my bachelor's in English about The Handmaid's Tale. So I have opinions, and I'm going to have to work really hard to not talk for 20 minutes about this book alone. I can't believe that I'm saying this about such a well-respected author, and an author that I love and respect so much. But it was not good. Like, I was not impressed. I am, of course, a little bit biased, but I think the climate aspect could have been explored more. And Margaret Atwood has been very involved in the climate movement too. So I was thinking, this is hopefully going to be something that she expands in this sequel to The Handmaid's Tale. And she doesn't expand it that much. And I think that's a shame. That's not why it's bad, but it's a shame. The aspect that I think is bad is, honestly, it read like a YA novel. And I have nothing against YA novels. The Hunger Games, it's brilliant. It's a brilliant series. But this read like a YA novel in a bad way. Particularly, I felt like the teenage characters were really poorly developed. Like, it was this really simplistic idea of what teenagers were like. I understand that she's a teenager and she wants to, like, give her opinion, but she's just being stupid, and you're just like, this doesn't feel real. More heinous, I think, is the book promotes a very individualistic approach to rebellion. The book is essentially about how these women are trying to resist Gilead, and this is kind of a spoiler, but you kind of know it's coming, how they precipitate the fall of Gilead. And it essentially has these individual young characters committing unbelievably heroic acts, individualistic heroic acts. They are supported by other people. That obviously is a part of rebellion and is a part of resistance, but I just sort of think that's a bit of an irresponsible thing to be like holding. We've got enough books about the individual chosen one hero. And to have Margaret Atwood writing the chosen one hero was just really disappointing, because I think she could have explored, you know, most rebellions, most resistances, most uprisings against authoritarian regimes happen through collective, groups. Yes, there can be individuals who maybe do a particularly heroic deed, but it's mostly about collectives. And it felt like such a shame to put such a spotlight on not just an individual, but also like a chosen one individual. I won't spoil how that is, though it's also incredibly predictable and you will see it coming. Also, the fact that Aunt Lydia, basically her way of rebelling, is to rise to power, to rise the ranks in Gilead, to become the most powerful woman in Gilead, so that she can get information and then release the information to bring the regime down. That's never happened in history, and that's just not a good thing to be promoting as a way of resisting an authoritarian regime. Is, just go against all of your morals, squash all of these people under your foot, cause untold suffering in order to become really powerful so you can bring it down. No, like that should not be an idea that we are like promoting through fiction. And like, let's face it, I feel like Atwood wrote this book as a way of like revamping The Handmaid's Tale, because The Handmaid's Tale is a lot about like how did they get into this situation. And then I feel like this sequel was meant to be about like, and how do we resist? How do we like really bring this down? And I'm just like, that is not the narrative we want to be selling people. And then there's a whole rant I could go on about how I feel like The Testaments damages the narrative integrity of The Handmaid's Tale, partly because I wrote my dissertation about the power of the author's voice in The Handmaid's Tale and how important it is that it's framed as a single historical text, as the one last testimony that we have from Gilead. And I have so many opinions on why the Testament shouldn't have been written, which is why it's taken me this many years to read the sequel, because I don't think the sequel should exist. And now that I've read the sequel, I stand by that. Cool if it's brought a whole new generation of readers to The Handmaid's Tale, but The Testament itself is not very good, and I don't think it should exist. I don't think it should have been written. So just overall, cannot believe that this author that I respect so much disappointed me so much. Sadly, like a big not recommend. I recommend The Handmaid's Tale. I recommend many other things by Margaret Atwood. She's a brilliant writer, brilliant person. But not The Testaments. But let's not end on a negative note. There was one more book I read. This was a random one that I picked out of the shortlist from the Climate Fiction Prize, and it actually ended up winning the Climate Fiction Prize, so it is Hum by Helen Phillips. The book is set in a near future where AI robots basically run everything, and it centres around this one family that is really struggling with money because they lost their jobs due to AI. She gets this surgery to change her face as a kind of part of a research project. That gets a lot of money, and so she was able to take her family to one of the last vestiges of nature in this world of, yeah, again, like climate breakdown. It's being sold and being advertised as being a lot about AI, which it is about AI, but I felt more powerful than that. It was about consumerism. The rampant consumerism of modern society and how AI can and probably will accelerate that to an even more crazy degree. It's looking at advertising and how advertising is proliferating across all areas of our life and how you can't escape it, and how when everything becomes so convenient and it becomes so easy and so quick to buy things, even this family that's kind of relatively struggling with money, how they fall into this consumerist trap. Now, after I read it, I gave it 3.5 stars, because there were certain things I didn't love about it. But in retrospect, I think I would maybe give it 4.5, because I'm still thinking about it on a regular basis, and I think that's always a good sign of a book. I mean, one of the things I really didn't like about it just really bugged me, was these ultra short chapters, like chapters barely a page long sometimes. Now I realise that was probably meant to reflect like short attention spans kind of vibes and have this, this quick feel, but because it's a continuous narrative, it didn't really work. So I just sort of found it irritating that some chapters were so small and there seemed to be no reason for a chapter break, and it just bugged my brain. But I really liked the writing style. It's incredibly accurate realism, it's incredibly believable. And it was like terrifying reading this book, because you're just going, we're only a couple of years away from this, aren't we? Oh my god. And like its attention to detail in the family life, the kids using like smartwatches and how they use the smartwatches, and how the details of this world were so well described. But at the same time, it had this edge of surrealism. It kind of reminded me of Something New Under the Sun, this sort of edge of surrealism that isn't, like, it's meant to reflect how weird life has got, basically. We've got these AI robots running around, running everything, and we've got advertising being shoved in our eyes every 5 seconds. It's surreal. And so that's reflected in the writing style. And another reason I think, like, immediately after reading the book, I wasn't so sure about it, but now, after more reflection, I like it more, is it reads more like a meditation than a thesis. Like, I wouldn't say this book comes down on a hard line or message about AI. I mean, it's not super positive, and it's certainly negative towards consumerism, but it feels like it's more sort of raising questions and raising ideas rather than sort of putting out a manifesto, which, at first I was like, but you haven't told me what to do kind of vibe immediately after reading it. But now looking back, I'm like, okay, no, fair, because AI doesn't necessarily have to be completely evil. It's more about how it gets used and if it ends up accelerating social inequalities that already exist. Struthless has made a brilliant video essay about this. I highly recommend watching it. Like, AI in itself is not necessarily bad, but it's currently being used for a lot of bad. So I think it's important to have these books that explore, that sort of question. Yeah, like I said, a meditation rather than a thesis. For me personally, it was really interesting to read because I am very anti-consumption. buy very little, mostly because I can't afford to, but also because as an environmentalist, I'm just trying to reduce my impact. Reading a book that's from the perspective of someone who is getting lost in that consumerist mindset, I think is important for me to sort of get outside of my bubble and my way of thinking as an environmentalist, to understand how people get drawn into that lifestyle. So that is all of the climate fiction books that I have read so far this year. If you are interested in joining the challenge that I set back in for the winter solstice, I will put all of the details below. It's a very large collection of not just fiction, but also poetry and non-fiction books, if you want to check it out. If you've read any of these books, I would love to know your thoughts. I love talking about books. I love hearing people's opinions. I love comparing notes. Maybe some of these books that I hated you loved, maybe the other way around. I just would love to hear it. So let me know about all of the climate fiction that you are reading. Yes, have a lovely longest day of the year.